And this is the mistake that I want to talk about today. The belief that strength and muscular size are so correlated that you can kind of assume they're gonna go hand in hand together as you progress.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
Alright, so good evening YouTube. As you can tell from that intro, I'm going to be responding to Vitruvian Physique's video talking about, do you need to get stronger to get bigger? Now, there's a couple things that came up in the video that, of course, piqued my interest. First of all, the question, but also the content. When it comes to the video itself, there are a lot of things that I want to break down, and this is not an attack on his character, just on his argument. I think that he is a very, I have more positive thoughts about him than I'm probably letting on, but, you know, he's not exactly my cup of tea as far as fitness YouTube content, but he is charismatic, has a great physique, so, you know, he definitely does walk the walk, so there's that, right? But at the same time, when it comes to this topic, and this video in particular, I just want to kind of pick it apart because the question, do you need to get stronger to get bigger, is central to the purpose of this channel. This is a power building channel. Now, power building is like classically defined as the combination of powerlifting and bodybuilding, but I kind of take it into a different direction where I say power building is just proper training practice for naturals. If you are a natural lifter, you should be a power builder in some capacity. I was going to create more videos talking about this. I actually have prepared a long series of videos kind of breaking this down, and those are going to come out. But given the opportunity and the fact that this video came out and I can actually share my thoughts on this, I find it to be very important to do so. So the first thing I want to talk about, he brings up a lot of anecdotes or case studies, as he calls them, where he discusses certain physiques and kind of talks about how their level of strength betrays the amount of muscularity they have, meaning they are maybe very aesthetic, very muscular, very like their physique is something to be desired for most people, given that he uses physiques like Z's, Brandon Harding, there are some others that were involved, while also contrasting them to people like Johnny Candido, or Omar Isuf. And there's a couple things that I want to make as a distinction for you, the viewer. Just because a physique is naturally achievable, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was naturally achieved. If you look at the rate of someone's progress, that's kind of the biggest dead giveaway, whether or not someone is natural or enhanced. And the key thing here is that when you have someone who is enhanced, they can rely on PEDs. If you are natural, you have to rely on programming. You have to rely on the actual structure of your training to give you those good results, which is why channels like Natural Hypertrophy, Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Massive Irons, Steve Shaw, Faz Lifts, Bald Omni-Man, there are so many channels that focus entirely on programming because that is the determining factor of whether or not you get bigger if you are natural. And oftentimes what they are going to use in their programs, strength. For Vitruvian Physique, he kind of labels this as a mistake because different people, like he kind of brings up an example of, he thought that if he had similar strength levels to them, he would have similar size to them as well, which is something that I'm going to discuss in this video also. Another thing that we need to discuss, and this is something that I've talked about previously on the channel, is the definition of strength. Strength in each context is kind of different. And to assume that if you have a specific 1-rep max, so everyone who has a 315 bench should have a similar level of chest development, is just completely asinine. It's completely ridiculous. If you have someone who's just very well built for the bench press, meaning their leverages, the range of motion that they have to use, they're very barrel chested and they have some small arms, and they are just built to bench, then their strength potential for that movement is very high. That means that the amount of strength that they'll need to add to that movement to elicit a muscle growth stimulus is high as well. They need to go from 315 to 405 in order for their chest to be big. Whereas someone who doesn't have the best strength potential, which is most people, because most of us are just average people, if we go up to a 315 bench, then we are going to have appreciable amount of chest size. So for the natural lifter, and for the purpose of this conversation, and the conversation of do you need to get stronger to get bigger, or do you need strength for size, strength, in my opinion, is more accurately summed up as the pursuit of getting stronger. The pursuit of getting stronger will result in more size, meaning tonnage, sets times reps times weight. If you increase any one of those three variables, you can expect better muscular hypertrophy. If you do more sets with the same amount of weight and reps, then you should be able to expect hypertrophy. If you increase the amount of reps you do with the same amount of weight and the same amount of sets, you should expect hypertrophy. So more reps with the same or heavier loads is still strength. More sets and reps with the same or heavier loads is still strength. If you kind of assume that a person's 1RM, it has to be related to a specific amount of muscle, that's where you kind of get into a gray area of things, because like I said, people have different builds, frames, strength potentials, and the muscular development of a person will vary even with comparable levels of strength. So I'm 6 feet. I've been 6 foot since like high school, and I kind of stopped there, which is very regrettable. I wanted to be 6'1". How unfortunate. But anyway, I'm 6 feet. I'm currently around 260. But when I first benched 225, I was around 200 at the time when I first hit 225. And compared to my friend who was 5'4", and he says 5'4", but he's a bit closer to 5'3". Still love him though. Still a king in my opinion. But he was 5'4", 160, 170 pounds, and his chest just looked fucking massive. But that wasn't just because of the amount of weight we were lifting. It was also because of the frame, the build, the leverages. There's a reason why shorter lifters just tend to look more muscular than taller ones, at least when they first start out, because it takes a lot longer for taller lifters to fill out that frame. It takes them a lot longer to get certain amounts of performance that kind of equate to whatever amount of size that they need. But generally speaking, what I tend to notice is that for smaller lifters who are very consistent with the gym, they tend to just develop certain muscles better because their muscle bellies are shorter. They just fill out faster, right? It's kind of like that girl who no, I'm not gonna make that joke, but I kind of referenced this, so you probably had it come to mind anyway, you sick freak. But anyway, another thing that kind of bothered me when in his video is that he talks about a certain study where they kind of compare the dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and that is something that we have known for quite a while. But there's a couple things that I want to say. First of all, he said you can watch his video, and I'll link it in the description because it's something to think about. You know, it's something to actually like reflect on. But he actually says you don't even need to read the study. You don't even need to read the abstract. You can just look at the title, and that is very dangerous. For a variety of different reasons. First of all, studies are very misleading. Studies oftentimes are done on such a small sample size that it's very difficult to get a general conclusion out of them. Also, sometimes, like, let's say the people in the study are very commonly novice lifters. They might be people who are recreational lifters, whatever that means, because in the confines of a study, recreational lifters can be screened out in a variety of different ways depending on the experimenter. For someone who doesn't work out, they can say, oh, someone's a recreational lifter if they lift once or twice a week. For us, the ones who go on YouTube to watch fitness content, anyone who just lifts once or twice a week is still a normie. They're still someone who's just, you know, like they just try to stay active for the most part. But for someone who is legitimately interested in the sport or the hobby of lifting weights, getting stronger, building muscle, generally speaking, you'll find it more common that they'll be lifting 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 times a week. But depending on the experimenter, the person doing the study, they can define certain terms. And the thing is, this also extends to the way that they measure certain things. If they decide to measure muscle growth via EMG data, which I don't think they do, but I'm just like kind of showing you an example because let's say you measure you measure like someone's height in terms of apples rather than using a standardized form of measurement, you're going to get very weird data, because if you want to have accurate measurements, you need to have very objective markers. But sometimes in studies, that's not always the case. You can find this with things like look at those weird videos that Jeremy Ether puts out where he just completely misinterprets a study, where he misreads an abstract, he misreads a title, he misreads whatever, and he doesn't see that within the study it even says that it is not conclusive for whatever. It is not statistically relevant or statistically significant. So to say you don't need to read the study, that it's just in the title, very misleading. And I'm not saying that that's not the case with this one, because I have to be completely honest here. I didn't read the study. I tried finding it in the description of his video, and I tried finding it on here, but you know, I spent my time doing other things, as namely creating this video, that I just couldn't find the study that he was referencing. But here's the other point to this. Yes, there is a dose-response relationship with volume and muscle growth. With that being said, even with that being true, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to get stronger. If you are just going to lighten the load, and let's say you can lift 135 pounds for 5, and then you go down to 100, and then you do that, or no, let's go even further than that. And this is kind of where it gets kind of unrealistic, but it's worth noting. Let's say you lift 135 for 10, and that's putting you close to failure. But then you decide, wait, I can do 20 pounds and I'll do that 100 times. Are you going to be getting the same amount of quality tonnage even though you're going to be doing more work? So at least I think that's, let me use easier numbers, but let's say you're doing 100 pounds for 10, so that's 1,000 pounds of tonnage versus 20 pounds for 100 reps, which is 2,000. Are you going to get twice as much muscle growth from that? Probably not, just because it's nowhere near close to the threshold for failure and intensity that you need in your programming, right? So those are things that you need to be a bit mindful of when it comes to the dose-response relationship between volume and muscle growth. You still need to be fairly close to failure. You still need to be using an intensity that is relevant. And if you just artificially increase your tonnage via these super high reps, then you're not going to be getting the best results that you possibly can. This doesn't mean that it's useless. You know, there's still something to be said about them, but it's not very efficient. And it becomes incredibly hard to progress if you have something that's just absurdly high. If you are only supposed to add weight whenever you can do 2 sets of 100 or 1 set of 100, the likelihood of you being able to progress is just not that high. The next thing that I would say is that given the case studies that he uses, there's a couple issues here. Case studies, they can provide hints. Sometimes they're more useful in giving us good questions to ask rather than actual answers to apply across the board. So they provide hints, but it would be completely dishonest to say that they're sufficient to give people enough guidance for what is most likely going to work for them. So even if yes, there is that dose-response relationship between muscle and volume, but that still comes down to basic programming. You still need to get stronger. This is why if you have someone who has a 500 1 rep max on the deadlift, what's going to build your muscle more? 500 for 1 or 475 for 2? These two is very different from the other example that I gave, because the amount of intensity that you're using, meaning the amount of weight you have on the bar, is a lot closer. Your proximity to failure is also a lot closer in these two cases, but in one case you do 1 rep, in the other you do 2, but you're still using a relevant intensity, meaning you're still going to get stronger, but you're also going to elicit more muscle growth in this comparison. I am very confident in saying, if you get stronger, you will be bigger, because on average, this is just much better advice than if you just look at these case studies. If you look at these case studies, you can be tricked into having the conclusion that, oh, I don't need to get that strong. No, it's not necessarily that you don't need to get that strong, meaning that you are still operating under the assumption that there is a specific 1 rep max I need to hit if I want to be big. That is a mistake. And I agree with that. That's something that I think that he is advocating in his video. But the thing is, you have to be very cognizant of how your words can be interpreted, and you want to be very clear and concise with them. And I do feel that given the case studies, given the way that the video is framed and certain things are said, some people will come to the conclusion, I don't need to get stronger, which is a just flat out lie. You are going to waste so much of your time if you don't get stronger. If you don't get stronger, if you don't have a caloric surplus at some point in your training life, then yeah, you're not going to get much bigger. You're not going to get very muscular, right? So on average, I'm very confident in saying that I would say that even beyond that, like if you want to get bigger, you do need to get stronger. I'm going to be that strong with this claim. The next thing I want to say as far as the case studies and the people that he brought up is that I am fairly certain that almost all of them are enhanced. And even if they are maybe not as enhanced as other people, or they're not using the biggest doses, they're still enhanced. Or let's say maybe they're not enhanced, right? And there's still other things that can be contributing to the fact that they are much stronger than their size would let on. So one thing that also came out of this video, and he said, was, how the hell do you have people with similar strength have near the same physique? And there's a couple things going into this, right? I don't know how many of my viewers watch Team 3D Alpha, Megan. So from Team 3D Alpha, and he kind of goes into like genetics very deeply. Now, there is something to say there. Genetics, type 2 muscle fibers, leverage for specific movements. These are things that have to be considered. If you have two people of the same heights, that doesn't necessarily mean that their bone structure is exactly the same. I have a friend who is 5'9". When he and I sit next to each other, we are actually the same height because he carries most of his height in his torso. So, that's just kind of an example there. Alexander Bromley talks about this as well. And that's just something that we have to keep in mind. Just because they are the same height doesn't necessarily mean that they're of the same build, and also their frame, their leverages, their genetic makeup, their type 2 muscle fiber distribution, and this is a factor that Vitruvian Physique does bring up later in his video, but I will still touch on that and why it's not entirely relevant for this question. The next thing that I want to say is that he does bring up examples of powerlifters and strength athletes. So he's contrasting, these aesthetic bras, these pretty boys, basically, like, like no other way to put it, who like very bodybuilder focused lifters, right? But when you look at someone like Johnny Candido, you can say that his physique is not very aesthetic, and you would be correct, because you're not going to go to Johnny Candido and say to yourself, I want to look like that. Not because, but you would look at him and be like, I want to be as strong as that. But here's the thing. His physique is not unimpressive. Vitruvian Physique does say that he has tree trunk legs, but you have to remember, he's doing the squat and deadlift, which hit both sides of the leg very, very intensely at a very high level. So that's going to be the case. As far as his other movements, with most powerlifters, they're not doing too much outside of what is necessary for their sport. So a lot of the things that are going to make your physique aesthetic are just not going to be present in the program if they don't need to be. As long as he's performing well for his sport, then that's what matters most, meaning that aesthetic training is just going to be on the back burner. As a result, his physique looks the way it does, but it's not small. If you take his measurements, I'm sure that they're just as big as probably some of the people that he brought up. I mean, look at a video that came out from Matt Vina. I'm sorry for name dropping, but I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only channel you watch, and I definitely shouldn't be. If you look across a variety of different channels, and he does bring up a lot of other, case studies, but if you look across certain things, what you'll find is that even with these powerlifters who might not be the most aesthetic, when you put them under certain lighting, which is also another factor I'm going to get into, but if you put them under certain lighting and you take their measurements, they're not small. They're not that far off. Another thing that we need to point out when it comes to comparing these two people is the fact that with bodybuilding, you are going to manipulate a lot of different things just based on lighting and posing. Depending on how you light things, depending on the way you pose, you are going to look very, very differently. So that is something that needs to be said as well. Just like powerlifters, they're not going to train in a way that's conducive for like aesthetics most of the time. And if they are an aesthetic person, then they're either including that kind of training or they just have good genetics and they're just going to grow from it no matter what. And of course, there's the PED issue as well. But those are things that I just feel like we're kind of left out with this video. Now, then he also goes on to reference Omar Isuf. I like to call him Omaha Steak Sauce. But, you know, the OG natty, you know, like the long-standing natty who just like, along with like, let's say Alpha Destiny and the like his physique is still very impressive regardless. He's a natural lifter, but he does have a strength background. Look at the way that he trains certain movements. When it comes to building muscle, if you want to reliably use progressive overload and use it in a way where you are going to be getting stronger but also getting bigger, then you need to make sure that your technique is also a certain way. He shows a clip of one of the lifters who has very comparable strength to another lifter that he references. I keep forgetting his name, but he compares himself, like he compares this smaller guy who has a really impressive bench to a bigger guy. And one thing you have to notice is look at the arch that he is using. He trains like a powerlifter, meaning he's maximizing his form to lift more weight. Maximizing your form to lift more weight is not the same as maximizing your form to get better hypertrophy. That's an issue there also. And then with, let's say, Omar Isuf, same thing there. I know some people kind of get on his ass for depth, but I mean, like, is he in a competition? No. But it's still impressive that he's able to perform the way that he does. So these are components of the video that I just wanted to touch on. Now, let's look at his actual argument. So in an argument, right? Like what I'm having right now is not just an argument with him, you know? It's not like an argument doesn't just mean disapproval, disagreeing, and then yelling at each other, right? I actually mean looking at his series of statements, one of which is a conclusion and the rest are premises meant to support or justify belief in the conclusion. He kind of outlines it like at the end of the video, but also throughout, right? The first thing he mentions that strength is a skill, and that's something that I just kind of touched on. Technique changes leverages. If you have an extreme arch, if you just have like your lever arms or bone, like, you know, the length of your bones or whatever, or like the length of your limbs just kind of help you lift more weight naturally, you know, that strength potential idea, as well as this, like whether if you have more type 2 muscle fibers or whatnot, then that is going to kind of determine how strong you are. And yes, handling heavier loads for lower reps does prime you to lift greater 1 rep maxes. So he kind of points out that strength is a skill. In volume equate, and then he goes on to say that in volume equated studies, in the study he's referencing, it's kind of comparing whether you do, the idea is that if you do 3 sets of 10 versus 10 sets of 3, you are going to see very similar, almost equal size gains in both groups. The difference is the group that does triples is going to be stronger. He goes on to say that you're likely going to be bigger with the 3 sets of 10, which is not accurate, because in a volume equated study, usually what always happens with volume equated studies is that muscle growth is the same between groups. It's when volume becomes higher in one group than the other that more muscle growth tends to be shown. So the issue here is that the 10 sets of 3 group, where they're lifting such heavy weights, it tends to be a very unfeasible training method for the long-term year-round training cycle. And in those studies where they are tested in that way, oftentimes it has the highest dropout rates. So that's something, right? But here's the thing, even with these volume equated studies, this does not bypass the need to get stronger. It does not bypass the need for progressive overload. Then he will go on to talk about muscle type distribution, which, like I said, muscle type distribution is not the end-all be-all for strength. Just because one person has more or less type 2 muscle fibers than you, and the strength potential varies between two lifters, it doesn't necessarily mean that's it. Like I said, and I mentioned throughout the video, frame, bone structure, leverage, these are all things that are also going to contribute to strength. And then, of course, technique, whether you can find ways to manipulate your range of motion to still stay relevant for the competition lift and whatever competition federation you compete in, where you can manipulate your form in a way where you can lift more weight, so you are a lot stronger, but you're not necessarily bigger because, like I said, you're using your form to maximize weight lifted, not muscle built. So that's why, like, the definition of strength needs to kind of be clear. Do we just mean pure raw 1RM? And if you have a 1RM, then you like a specific 1RM, then you're going to have specific amount of size? Then yes, that is a very wrong way to look at things, and that is not how it works at all. But you still need to get stronger regardless of who you are. If you want to get more muscular, you need to get stronger. And then he kind of has a final point talking about two types of muscular growth, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy versus myofibular hypertrophy, which I don't think is necessarily relevant because in logic, and I mean the actual school of logic, right? There is something known as logical consequence, which means that truth is preserved by virtue of form. So I'm not going to go into a full-on explanation of that, but I'm just going to kind of show how it relates in this example. Even if all of his premises are true, I do not think that it supports the conclusion, meaning I do not think that it logically follows that you would not need to get stronger if you want to get bigger. In my view and understanding of, training, progressive overload is still the most important factor of muscle growth. More sets, more reps, and more weights over time is what is going to get you stronger. Now, as let's say caveats and conditions, you need to keep your form the same across, like, as you add these loads, meaning you can't just add weight, change your form so that way your form is now maximized to lift weight or you're cutting range of motion to lift more weight. No, you need to keep form the same. You need to keep time under tension the same, or tempo the same, or range of motion. The amount of tonnage you do should increase over time without these other variables changing, because then now you're changing too many variables to say that you are accurately measuring the same thing over time. So he continues to go on about correlation does not equal causation, which is something we're all aware of. But like I said, across the board, if there was something that I was going to say for natural lifters, how to get bigger, my advice would be get stronger on basic movements. Across the board, doesn't matter who you are. Push-ups, dips, bench press, overhead press, barbell rows, squats, deadlifts, and it can be very close variations of all these movements. So, like pull-ups, inverted rows, and all those other movements. If you just get stronger at them, you're going to be bigger. There's no exceptions. I have yet to find someone who has not gotten stronger with those movements who has not put on an appreciable amount of size. If you have someone who has a high strength potential, yes, they will need to be disproportionately strong, or in Vitruvian Physique's eyes, which, might be an unfair assessment, but they will need to be as strong as they look in order to build more muscle. Meaning that if you have someone who is just absolutely a tank, then yeah, they're going to need to bench in the high threes in order to add a lot of chest size. Or if you have someone who is just like a bit smaller, a bit more compact, then yeah, sure, they can get to 315 and then have a big ass chest. And then if you have someone with a low strength potential, then they don't need to get as strong, they don't need to have as high of a 1 rep max, but it doesn't really matter because they still need to get stronger. This is why I think his argument fails in two ways. In first, I don't think it's factually correct, meaning I take issue with the premises, as I've hinted at and talked about throughout this entire video. Because there's a lot of factors that are kind of left out that make the premises seem untrue, or at least insufficient in his reasoning. First of all, we have to bring up the issue of natural versus enhanced. Enhanced, like PEDs, is basically injecting yourself with training. And that is going to be a huge advantage to people who take PEDs, right? The next thing is skeletal build, your frame, your leverages, whether or not your body just agrees to certain movements. And if it does, then yes, you're going to be stronger just naturally, or innately. And then that just continues to go on with leverages. So there's things that kind of poke holes or have or need to be addressed in addition to the points he makes in his premises, right? And then secondly, I don't think his argument is valid, because even if all of his premises are true, I do not think that it is a logical consequence. I do not think that even if his premises are true, it logically implies that you do not need to get stronger. Even if, going through his argument, even if strength is a skill, true. In volume equated studies, let's say in volume equated studies, in volume equated studies, whether a group does 3 sets of 10 or 10 sets of 3, the 3 sets of 10 group builds more muscle, which is something that he kind of says. Even if that's true, right? And then, of course, muscle type distribution. So you need more if someone has more type 2 muscle fibers. And then, of course, the 2 types of muscular growth, even if that theory of sarcoplasmic environment fluid or hypertrophy becomes more clear. Even with all of those 4 things being 100% true and in line with reality, it does not logically eliminate the need to get stronger. Even if someone who does 3 sets of 10 will get more results than someone who does 10 sets of 3, over time, they'll still need to increase one of the 3 variables of tonnage: sets, reps, and weight, meaning they still need to get stronger. So that's why I think his argument just kind of falls apart, because even if his premises are true, it doesn't logically follow that his conclusion must be true. If you have a valid argument means that if your premises are true, it is impossible, and I mean this in a very hard sense of the term, it is impossible for your conclusion to be false. With this, even if his premises are true, it does not eliminate the need to get stronger, and that's what I want to point out with this video. I hope that I have done that, and I hope that you found this interesting, enlightening, entertaining, and if you have any questions, send them to me on Instagram. If you'd like to work with me as a coach, that option is in the link in the description below. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Causation, standstrength.com, and have a good night.